Hello and welcome to History Bite, and today we're going to be discussing Vasco da Gama, the Portuguese navigator who in 1498 became the first European person to find a sea route to India. It had been widely believed that the only route to India was overland. However, when Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, the overland routes to India became incredibly dangerous and more hostile towards Western Europeans. With the expansion of the Muslim Ottoman Empire, trade routes became strained, and there was a fear in the West that the riches, the spices, and the flavours of the East would become harder to get. European monarchs became determined to find another route to India, and this could happen perhaps by sea. In the 15th century, Portugal was one of the largest maritime powers in the world, all thanks to Henry the Navigator. He had established a navigation school for talented geographers, cartographers and navigators, and so Portugal came to the forefront of maritime experience. It was likely that if anyone was to be successful to find a sea route to India, it would be the Portuguese. However, trying to find India by sailing west had already been done. The Spanish had sponsored Christopher Columbus in 1492 on his voyage of discovery. However, he hadn't found India, but a new world completely. It wasn't long before the Portuguese had established themselves on the continent as well, and fierce competition led the Pope himself to have to intervene. The resulting Treaty of Tordesillas of 1494 drew an imaginary line from north to south. Everything west of the line would be controlled by the Spanish. Everything to the east could be claimed by the Portuguese. This meant that if Portugal were to find a route to Asia, they couldn't go west, but they would have to go east. So how does Vasco da Gama fit into this, and who was he? Well, Vasco da Gama was born in southern Portugal in 1460 to a wealthy seagoing family. He had learnt the trade of seamanship and navigation in service to the crown on one of their merchant ships. He would get his first real taste for exploration travelling with Bartholomew Dias. Dias had explored the coast of Africa but had never made it to India. His voyages, however, had proven that it was possible to sail around the Cape of Good Hope in order to reach India. So in 1497, when Manuel I became the new king of Portugal, he named Vasco da Gama the leader of a brave new expedition. Da Gama's mission would be to sail around the Cape, make his way to India, establish trade links and return with valuable goods, all in all covering around 24,000 miles in the process. Da Gama set sail from Lisbon on the 8th of July 1497 with 4 ships and 170 men bound for India. Their voyage took them south, but because of the prevailing trade winds, they had to reroute themselves towards the coast of Brazil in order to make their way south to cut across the winds. On the 7th of November, they arrived in St. Helena port, and it had been 13 weeks since da Gama's crew had last seen dry land. 2 days later, the fleet rounded the Cape of Good Hope, stopping in Mossel Bay before travelling 1,600 kilometres, reaching Mozambique in March 1498, which was the first in a range of East African Muslim cities. Da Gama knew these were Muslim states, and so in order to gain an audience with the Sultan of Mozambique, he dressed up and pretended to be a Muslim. Unfortunately, he was unable to give a suitable gift to the Sultan and was met with hostility. Da Gama had failed to realise that what were riches to the Portuguese in ivory, gold and pearls were common in the Indian Ocean trade, and so therefore were not new or surprising to the Sultan. While Da Gama was disappointed with this rejection, the realisation of the riches to be had in establishing trade in the Indian Ocean would have been captivating. In response to the hostility faced in Mozambique, Da Gama, as he was sailing out of port, ordered his ship to fire on the city in retaliation. They continued on to Mombasa, where Da Gama began looting unarmed Arab merchant ships, and so when he arrived at the coast, he faced a similar hostility as he'd done in Mozambique. However, his arrival in April 1498 in Malindi was more fruitful, and he was able to hire a navigator, Ahmed ibn Majid, who led him on to India. This proved successful, and Da Gama was able to reach Calicut on the Malabar coast in May 1498. He was welcomed by the Zamorin, or king, of Calicut. When the Zamorin asked Da Gama why he'd come to India, Da Gama replied, "In search of Christians and spices." Calicut happened to be the main hub for the spice trade, especially in the trade of pepper, so Da Gama had really hit the jackpot. He and his crew remained in Calicut for 3 months, but Muslim traders, who perceived Da Gama as no more than a pirate, were increasingly alarmed by his attempt to muscle in on their terrain. And once again, Da Gama was disappointed to find that his gifts were not received in the same light as he had intended. The Zamorin had found his gifts inferior, but despite this, Da Gama was able to gather enough goods to return home by sea. However, in a very gross act, Da Gama ordered that a number of Indians be taken captive as hostages to ensure their safe departure. He also ignored the warnings he was given about the monsoon weather, and the resulting unfavourable winds caused the journey to take up to 4 times as long as it had taken to reach India. As a result of the extra length of the journey, scurvy broke out on the ships, meaning that of the original 170 crew, only 54 returned home alive. Even his own brother succumbed to disease. It served to illustrate the great dangers and perils of sailing in that age. Da Gama arrived back in Lisbon in August 1499, having spent 2 years away from home. So this was the first time a European had set sail and found India by sea. It was miraculous, but what impact did it have? News of Da Gama's successful mission was greeted with enthusiasm and national pride. Manuel I couldn't wait to show off and brag about this great achievement to the other countries of Europe. The sailors were given a triumphal welcome and showered with praise and rewards. Vasco da Gama's voyage was special not just in the achievement itself, but because he had succeeded where Columbus and others had failed. Upon his return, he received the title of the Admiral of the Indian Seas. Despite failing to secure a commercial treaty with Calicut and the loss of 2 ships on the voyage, the value of the goods brought back from India demonstrated the wealth that could be generated from this new sea route. Through its connections with the Indian Ocean markets, Portugal would now become the principal supplier of luxury commodities like pepper, chili and cinnamon. This launched Portugal into becoming one of the major European powers of the 15th century. The journey of Vasco da Gama was genuinely pioneering and a remarkable achievement, especially given the dangers and limitations of ocean travel in the 15th century. Da Gama had the courage and the bravery to pursue new routes, making his reputation as a master explorer unquestionable. But the methods he used are now being revisited by historians as further evidence of colonial greed and the ambition of Europeans. But Da Gama's later voyages to India would be marred with brutality and cruelty towards the local population as he tried to repress them to Portuguese rule. But these and the horrific stories that came out of later voyages are for another video another day. The legacy of Da Gama's first voyage lives on. This voyage set in motion the beginnings of mass European colonization of Southeast Asia and a mixing of cultures unlike it had ever been seen before, and the effects of which we still feel to this very day. If you enjoyed this video and would like to find out more about history, why not subscribe to our channel or follow us on Twitter or Facebook?